again, let me just welcome everyone to this special Juneteenth commemoration with Interwoven Congregations and this public reading of Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed's On Juneteenth. We're going to follow in a moment with an invocation, then a brief word about Interwoven Congregations. After that, we then will enter into our On Juneteenth public reading. It's going to begin by Reverend Janet Garner-Mullins saying a word about the author for us tonight. I'm going to do an introduction of our readers, 7 of us all together, and then we will enter into the public reading. We will close with an open discussion at the end. I have an invitation for everyone. And then Reverend Janet Garner-Mullins is going to close us with a word of prayer. So that's what the evening looks like. Thank you for being here and being a part of it. And I now want to welcome the Rabbi Scott Perlow of Adat Shalom Reconstructionist Congregation, who's going to offer our invocation. Rabbi Scott, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Baruch nafshi et Adonai, bless the Lord, O my soul. It was General Order number 3 that set the slaves free. That's what it took to recognize the obviousness of dignity and humanity, and then they called this day Juneteenth. Dear God, how in God's name did it even become acceptable to oppress them and to stress morally, according to the Vice President of the Confederacy? Yes, I did read page 123 that there was no such natural state of equality. God, in whose holy name we pray, we ask you, do not delay in bringing forth not a new world conceived in liberty, but the world as it ought to be, the world we should have had eyes to see, for every human being is born free. It's a crime to obscure it. You know, the founders said that slavery was evanescent, but before they knew it, men were dying on battlefields right around here in defense of it. So, dear God, let us not be victims of a parsimonious sentiment that laments events and presentiments, yet lacks the courage of our intentions, and has only the conviction of our resentments. You are the one. Don't let us be stuck in the muck. Lift us up. Let us be lightning struck by just how simple it can be. We aren't the ones who declare people free. That's your job. So give us the strength. Let us do the work so that people can just be. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. I want to say a brief word about Interwoven Congregations, which is dedicated to helping faith communities be agents for racial justice and healing. Just want to give a shout out to the leadership, to the folks who help to guide, support, and fuel the work of Interwoven Congregations. A number of our board members helping us out this evening as some of our readers, and Anton Ahrens from Topeka, Kansas, is helping with our tech this evening as well. We are active around a number of parts in the country supporting congregations with online consulting, various tools that we've developed online as well, and then also in-person consulting where we're connecting with people on the ground. So different ways that we're able to reach out and connect, and would love to be in more connection with congregations around the country. So if that's something that would be of value to you, we'd love to be in touch. But I want to let you know about our next upcoming event, which will be in August. It's our next congregational roundtable. How is your congregation getting out of the gate with its anti-racism work? We're going to go over some key resources and tools that help congregations gauge where they are, do an assessment of their faith community, and then work on developing an anti-racism policy. 3 key steps at the outset of this work. And if you have a congregation that's involved in these issues, would really invite you to be a part of the roundtable in August on the 28th. But we want to move now into this public reading, beginning by inviting Reverend Dr. Janet Garner-Mullins to share a word about this author whose words we're going to be lifting up today, Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed. So Reverend Janet, thank you for offering these words about the author tonight.
Thank you all so very much for your being here and for participating in this most emotional and most important day. As we gather to reflect on Juneteenth, we recognize the scholars whose work deepens our understanding of this historic day. One such voice is Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, a Pulitzer Prize winning historian and legal expert born in Livingston, Texas, who has spent her career illuminating the complexities of race, freedom, and justice in America. And from an early age, Dr. Gordon-Reed broke barriers, becoming the first Black child to integrate her elementary school in Conroe, Texas. She went on to study at Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School, where she made history as the first African American editor of the Harvard Law Review. Today, she's a distinguished Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard, influencing conversations on race, law, and the legacy of historical figures in America. Her scholarship has reshaped historic narratives, particularly through her groundbreaking research on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Her book, The Hennings of Monticello, An American Family, earned her a Pulitzer Prize for History, providing an in-depth exploration of the Hemings family, challenging some of the long-held assumptions and reshaping historical narratives on slavery and the power of early America. And now, beyond those scholarships on Jefferson, Dr. Gordon-Reed has also been a powerful voice in the study of Juneteenth in her book on Juneteenth. Her book combines personal history, historical analysis, offering insights into the struggle and resilience for ongoing pursuit of justice tied to the Juneteenth legacy. And through her work, she reminds us that freedom is not just a moment, it's a continuous fight, an evolving dialogue, and a call to action. So let us engage in thoughtful discussion, respectful discussion, honoring the resilience and the voices that make Juneteenth such a pivotal moment in American history. And in doing so, we ensure that Juneteenth remains more than a remembrance. It remains a living testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the promise of true liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Janet. I want to take an added moment then to introduce everyone to our readers this evening. It includes Reverend Janet Garner-Mullins from Charlotte, Reverend Stephanie Moss from Kansas City, Brother John Anderson, also from Kansas City, Phyllis Lerner from Bethesda, Maryland, Joanne Jenkins from Charlotte, Danita Green from Richmond, Virginia, and then myself, and I'm coming to you from Groningen in the Netherlands, but also spend time working as our nonprofit is based out of Bethesda, Maryland. So we're spanning a few time zones here. But I want to make a couple notes before we proceed. One is to note that the text by Dr. Gordon-Reed is alt text. It does not have images in the text, but in preparing for this public reading, we've added a series of images to go along with the text throughout all the readings. Saying that, we want to let folks know that in the second chapter of her book, she speaks about some of the racial violence that takes place in Texas. We include some of that text in tonight's readings, and there are some images that go along with that, which we just want folks to be aware of ahead of time. They are important elements to this Juneteenth story. We also want to know that there will be several points during this evening's reading when we'll pause for a time of silent reflection. And we invite you just to simply reflect on a suggested question that will be on the screen for you. We want to go forward now into our public reading of On Juneteenth by Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed.
To my surprise, some years back, I began to hear people outside of my home state, Texas, talking about and actually celebrate the holiday Juneteenth. June 19, 1865, shortened to Juneteenth, was the day that enslaved African Americans in Texas were told that slavery had ended, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and just over 2 months after Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. Despite the formal surrender, the Confederate Army had continued to fight on in Texas until mid-May. It was only after they finally surrendered that Major General Gordon Granger, while at his headquarters in Galveston, prepared General Order Number 3, announcing the end of legalized slavery in this state.
The truth is, I confess here that I was initially annoyed, at least mildly so, when I first heard that others outside of Texas acclaimed the holiday. My twinge of pervasiveness grew out of the habit of seeing my home state and the people who reside there as special. The things that happened were there couldn't have happened in other places. Non-Texas could never really understand what the events that took place in Texas actually meant. My proprietary attitude about Juneteenth quickly disappeared. Rather than keeping the holiday to ourselves, Texans have been in the forefront of trying to make Juneteenth a national holiday. As I think of it, it's really a very Texas move. To say that something that happened in our state was enough consequence to the entire nation that it should be celebrated nationwide. The essays that follow look at history through the medium of personal memoir, a Texan's view of the long road of Juneteenth, the events surrounding the date itself, what happened afterward, and how all this shaped life in Texas, my family's life and my own. My Texas roots go deep. On my mother's side, back to the 1820s. On my father's side, at least to the 1860s. It is the American story told from the most American place.
Chapter 1. This, then, is Texas. Until Alaska became a part of the United States in 1859, Texas was the largest state in the Union. 268,580 square miles, larger than Kenya, almost 3 times the size of the United Kingdom, although eclipsed by the nation's vast 49th state. Many Texans still cherish their state's distinction as the largest of the lower 48. For them, being the biggest in terms of size is unquestionably a good thing and stands for the state's character, as is everything's big in Texas, making the place and the people who live there seem larger than life. Which part of the state, though, and which people matter most? As for the people, the cowboy, the rancher, the oil man, all wearing either 10-gallon hats or Stetsons, dominate as the embodiments of Texas, of great importance. As I have said in other contexts, the image of Texas has a gender and a race. Texas is a white man. What that means for everyone who lives in Texas and is not a white man is part of what I hope to explore in the essays in this book.
Livingston, the town where I was born, in more easterly Polk County and Conroe, the town where I grew up, 50 miles south in Montgomery County, are part of the Big Thicket, an area covering about 3 million acres in the eastern part of Texas, so named for its dense forests and plant life. The area has been called North America's environmental arc for ecological diversity unparalleled in the Earth's northern hemisphere. It is estimated that 75% of the North American's bird species either live in the big thicket or spend some time there during their yearly migrations. West Texas is stereotypically the home of two of the figures mentioned above: the cowboy riding the range and the rancher, owner of the land on which the cowboy worked. The third figure, the Texas oilman of more recent vintage, had his origins in East Texas, but migrated first to North Texas and then west. The oilman soon challenged the cowboy and the rancher as the archetypal Texan.
There is, however, another important figure critically missing from other defining depictions of Texas, a figure who helped make Juneteenth necessary: the slave plantation owner. Although this species of Texan no longer exists, the influence of the world he put in place continues to this day. He resided mainly in what became the populous East, an area developed by the man known as the father of Texas, Stephen F. Austin. The Virginia-born and Missouri-raised Austin came to Texas not to create cattle ranches or hire cowboys, but to turn huge swaths of the Mexican province, Coahuila y Tejas, into a Western version of the cotton fields of Mississippi that had produced such great wealth for plantation owners. What is now the southeastern part of Texas was, in many ways, the perfect place to try this. The soil was amazingly fertile, the growing season long, and there was access to the Gulf of Mexico for shipping harvested crops.
For a number of reasons, the Mexican government was eager to have Anglo-Americans come to the area and develop it. There was, however, a problem. Anti-slavery sentiment was strong in Mexico, which only recently separated from Spain. As much as they wanted whites to come to Texas, most Mexicans were not so keen on them bringing chattel slavery with them. Austin knew that posed a threat to his enterprise. A good number of the Americans who would want to settle on land in this area would hardly want to clear and work that land themselves. They expected to have enslaved people do the clearing and planting, and they would hesitate to move to Texas without assurances that their property rights in enslaved people be preserved. Austin and his Tejano, ethnic Mexicans living in Texas, partners engaged in intense lobbying to convince Mexican legislators to protect slavery as a way of ensuring the success of their colonization effort. Austin told everyone who would listen to that without slavery, the Anglo colonies would never fully succeed, and Americans who came to Texas would surely be poor for the rest of their lives.
The matter was settled when Texas successfully rebelled against Mexico and set up the Republic of Texas in 1836. With this move, the right to enslave was secured, and white settlers poured into the new republic. Texas, as its own country, lasted but a decade. White Texans feared that their new country's weakness, Mexico remained a potentially formidable foe, made it vulnerable to calls for abolition, which began to grow in the 1830s in the United States and among their trading partners, including Great Britain, which abolished slavery in 1833. The solution, Anglo-Texans believed, was to become annexed to the United States. Indeed, that had been the goal of many Texians, supporters of the break from Mexico, from the start. This happened in 1845, followed by the acceptance of Texas as a part of the Union.
20 years after being formally accepted into the American Union, the armed forces of the United States shattered Texas' dream of a cotton-based slave economy when it defeated Texas and its fellow Confederates in the Civil War. There is no way to get around the fact that slavery was a central reason Anglo-Texans wanted out of Mexico. The choice for slavery was deliberate, and that reality is hard to square with the desire to present a pristine and heroic origin story about the settlement of Texas. As far as my early education went, these aspects of our state history was never fully discussed. When slavery in Texas was mentioned, it was presented as an unfortunate event that was to be acknowledged but quickly passed over. There was no sense of the institution's centrality. Slavery was done. There was no point in dwelling on the past. Texas was all about the future, about what comes next, the next cattle drive, the next oil well, the next space flight directed by NASA's Mission Control in Houston.
Except we did dwell on the past. We were exhorted to remember the Alamo and to remember Goliad, famous events in Texas' fight for independence from Mexico. Why were these things to be remembered while the history of an important reason Stephen F. Austin came to Texas and all that flowed from the fateful decision to put slavery at the heart of Texas to be forgotten? As the years have gone by, I've had occasion to think more about tragedy and triumph in relationship to Texas, its past, present, and future. It is possible, very likely, actually, that my time there prepared me for the work I do as a historian, excuse me, of the earlier American Republic. Another moment in triumph and tragedy were inexorably entwined. Disentangling those threads and viewing them critically has been, in fact, a good thing in the context of our national history, broadening our understanding of who we were and who we are now. This same process could do wonders for Texas as well.
I want to invite you into our first moment for silent reflection and reflect on the question of what strikes you about this brief history of the founding of the Republic of Texas and its entry into the Union.
As we noted earlier, for this next chapter, there are slide images that depict graphic racial violence. Chapter 2, A Texas Town. Until the middle of the 1960s, Booker T. Washington High School was the virtual center of the Black community in Conroe, Texas, my hometown. I attended kindergarten at Washington, but switched in first grade to Hulan Anderson Elementary, a white school. This act drew a lot of attention to me and my family because that move helped put in motion changes in the racial dynamics of our town. So I integrated my town's school, a la Ruby Ridges, with the chief difference being that I was not escorted to my first day of school by federal marshals. My father drove me and dropped me off. There was a bus route taking white children who lived in the vicinity of my elementary school, but evidently it was decided that it would be best that I not take it. I later learned that my parents and the school district negotiated about how it would all proceed. No fuss would be made. My parents would not talk to the press about it. I would just arrive at school and begin first grade as if there was nothing to it.
There was, of course, something to it. This was a new thing in our little corner of East Texas. There were threats against my family, which I also didn't learn of until later, but nothing came of them. William Faulkner famously wrote in his 1951 novel, Requiem for a Nun, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." I believe the Nobel laureate was wrong about that. The past is dead. But, like other formally living things, echoes of the past remain, leaving their traces in the people and events of the present and future. A bit of history, then, is needed for context. East Texas had been the locus of slavery in the plantation system even before Texas became a state. The legacy of that time and its baked-in racial hierarchy survived long after the enslaved people were freed. Texans who had enslaved blacks and had been defeated in the Civil War turned on the freed people with a vengeance, seeking to maintain the control they had during slavery. Along with Jim Crow, one of the chief means of doing this was extra-legal violence. Montgomery County, of which Conroe was the county seat during my childhood, was known for being particularly harsh for Black people.
Just to mention the more publicized examples, in 1885, 20 years after the end of the Civil War, in the town of Montgomery, just 7 miles from Conroe, Bennett Jackson, a young Black man, was lynched after being charged with breaking into a home and assaulting a white woman and her children. That Jackson would be lynched was well known ahead of time, as it turned into a public celebration for white citizens in the area. Men, women, and children gathered and had a picnic to watch. In 1922, a Black man, Joe Winters, was burned alive at the stake on the courthouse square after a teenage girl accused him of rape. And in 1940, there was the case of Texas versus White. In 1936, Bob White was accused of raping Ruby Cochran, a white woman in town. He was found guilty in the first trial and sentenced to die in the electric chair. The case was appealed, and a new trial was ordered. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Writing to the court in 1941, Justice Hugo Black held that the confession obtained by severe beatings and keeping White incommunicado violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment.
With that, the case went back down for retrial. It was during the final proceeding in Conroe in June of 1941 that W.S. Dude Cochran, Ruby Cochran's husband, walked to the front of the courtroom and shot White in the back of the head, killing him instantly. He handed the gun to the prosecutor and turned himself over to the sheriff. He was arrested and was out on a bond of $500. His trial, held a few days later, lasted only 3 hours. After the prosecutor's closing statement, the courtroom erupted in applause and cheered. The jury deliberated for 2 minutes and returned a verdict of not guilty. And Cochran walked out of court a free man after having murdered Bob White in an open courtroom in front of a judge, lawyers, and dozens of spectators.
My first grade teacher, Mrs. Daughtry, could not have handled my time in her care any better. Indeed, the principal, Mr. Moorhead, and every teacher with whom I came into contact seemed committed to rising above the town's history to make things work. I never experienced any different treatment from them. In fact, I felt nothing but their support. There was an oddity of being on display. Periodically, small groups of visitors, educators, I assume, would show up and stand in the doorway of the classroom to observe how things were going. A Black child in a room with maybe 25 other white students. There was, for a time, only me. One Black child was not exactly an invasion. The degree of racial tolerance among whites has always been about numbers. Also, I was a good student. We got letter grades in our subjects, and the local newspaper printed the names of kids who were on the honor roll, and my name appeared there.
When I went to Sadler Clinic, where my family doctor practiced, I knew there were 2 separate entrances, one leading into the waiting room for Blacks and the other into the waiting room for whites. The receptionist sat in a room with windows facing out into either waiting room so she could handle patients based on race. As we checked in or settled the bill, I could see into the other area and noted how much larger and better appointed it was, with a bigger variety of magazines. Even at that young age, the magazine deficit bothered me the most. When we went to the movies at the old style Criterion Theater, Blacks had to sit in the balcony. This went on, as I think of it, even after the de jure segregation had ceased. But the power of habit, bolstered by a silent undercurrent of intimidation and fear, was strong. The faint echoes of Bennett, Winters, and White reverberated.
Not all of them, but many white store owners in these little towns were gratuitously mean to us. As for my own situation, matters were more complicated than just White's reaction to my leaving Washington for Anderson. Some members of the Black community felt that my parents were making a statement, alas, a negative one, about the quality of teaching and education at Washington. That my mother taught there made things even more complicated. was suggesting by her actions that she and her colleagues were not capable. In towns all over the South, the schools in Black communities were a source of pride that inspired loyalty. Still, I became something of a controversial figure at age 6. For years after that, people I didn't know knew me, and that knowledge either made them inclined to be very positive toward me or very negative. I remember standing in line one bright sunny day, waiting for the bus. I heard an older boy who was Black say to his companions, who were also Black, "That's her." I was in the adjoining line, perhaps 2 people behind him. He turned around in his line, reached over the people standing between us, and began to punch me repeatedly in the chest as hard as he could. I was shocked and terrified, and I had no idea who this person was or why he was hitting me. His expression held such hatred.
I never told my parents. Older brothers came in handy in situations like this. I told my brothers what had happened. One confronted the boy, evidently did a little pounding himself, and the boy never bothered me again. As the years passed, there were other less intense moments like that. People I didn't know wanted to fight me or threatened to beat me up.
The move toward integration may have killed off one bad thing, Jim Crow education, but it took some valuable things with it. The notion of separate being inherently unequal didn't take account of what it meant for Black students to have Black teachers, particularly at that precise moment in history. I had no doubt that my teachers at Anderson cared about me. But it was different outside of school. We had no real point of connection. There was no way that Mrs. Daughtry or Mrs. Gilliland, my second grade teacher, as lovely as they were to me, could know me as well as the teachers at Washington knew their students. Sometimes, while playing with friends in my neighborhood after school, the jump rope would drop and kids would disappear into their homes. I soon learned the reason for the drill. They had spotted their teacher's car coming down the road. They didn't want her, it was usually Mrs. Dauncey, to see them outside playing when they should be inside studying and doing their homework. Clearly, there was something extra going on here.
Many of the Black teachers saw themselves as on a mission. Education was about the individual students, just as it was for my teachers at Anderson. But there was an additional component, an explicit mission of race uplift. My teachers at Anderson did not have to concern themselves with that. Becoming educated was an act of resistance. The classroom was a site of that resistance, along with ministers, many of whom also saw racial uplift as part of their task. School teachers were among the most respected members of the Black community. The effects of integration on school children, Black and white, has received a great amount of attention over the years. What has been much less considered is the effect that integration had on the Black teachers who were in Black schools when the changes initially came. Many of them, including in my town, were taken out of the classroom. The children were integrated, not the teaching staff.
Invite us into another moment of silent reflection. What thoughts did Dr. Gordon-Reed's personal story about integrating her elementary school stir in you?
Chapter 3, Origin Stories, Africans in Texas. It's a safe bet that most people in the United States, when they think of it, believe that Black people first appeared in North America in 1619. The story of the 20 and odd Negroes that John Rolfe announced in matter-of-fact fashion to have arrived in Virginia that year is often taken as the beginning of what we might call Black America. From that 20 to 4 million by the time of emancipation in 1865 to nearly 40 million today. I remember hearing in school, probably because I was in Texas, stray references to a man of African descent, a Negro named Estebanico, who was in what would become Texas during the time of Spanish exploration in the 1520s with the famous Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. I hadn't been told that other people of African descent, some enslaved, some not, arrived with the Spanish when they came to the Americas. It was in St. Augustine, Florida, in fact, that racially based slavery as an organized system began on American soil, established by the Spanish as early as 1565.
Chapter 5, Remember the Alamo. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. With those famous words, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his masterpiece, The Souls of Black Folk, identifies the central dilemma facing Black people in the United States, that to a great degree, Blackness and Americanness have been cast in opposition to one another, a predicament created by the details of history and the desires of others.
Almost from the very beginning of their time in North America, Blacks have shown their deep and patriotic attachment to the country they helped to build, even as they had been utterly realistic about the way many of their fellow countrymen viewed them. Persisting in the face of that reality has been a struggle of centuries. What are we then to make of Black Texans who may feel the two-ness Du Bois described when thinking about their status as Americans, but also have to confront the same double consciousness when considering their place in Texas? African Americans in all the states of the former Confederacy, just for example, are potentially in the position of loving a place that has been deeply oppressive to their ancestors. What sane Black person could feel nostalgia for the so-called Golden Age of Virginia, the period from the 1730s to the 1760s?
In 1967, there was a release of the 1960 film The Alamo. I was taken to see it with my best friend. Although the heroes of the Alamo were already known to me, I didn't know that an enslaved person was there. The main point conveyed in the movie and in my history classes was that the men who fought and died at the Alamo did so for a noble cause, occupying the Mexican army until Sam Houston could organize his forces. This was part of the war for Texas independence, which was unquestionably a good thing. Even before the fall of the Alamo, delegates had met at Washington on the Brazos and drafted a Texas Declaration of Independence that is essentially a knockoff of Jefferson's American Declaration. Pronouncements followed by a list of grievances. What the Texas Declaration very pointedly does not take from Jefferson are any words about self-evident truth that all men are created equal.
Section 6. All free white persons who shall immigrate to this republic shall be entitled to all the privileges of citizenship.
In the new republic, only whites were welcome.
Section 9. All persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage, so shall remain in the like state of servitude. Congress shall pass no laws to prohibit immigrants from bringing their slaves into the republic with them, nor shall Congress have the power to emancipate slaves, nor shall any slaveholder be allowed to emancipate his or her slave or slaves without the consent of Congress, unless he or she shall send his or her slave or slaves without the limits of the republic. No free person of African descent, either in whole or in part, shall be permitted to reside permanently in the republic without the consent of Congress. And the importation or admission of Africans or Negroes into this republic, excepting from the United States of America, is forever prohibited and declared to be piracy.
Slavery was to be a permanent state for Blacks.
Section 10. All persons, Africans, the descendants of Africans and Indians excepted, who were residing in Texas on the day of the Declaration of Independence shall be considered citizens of the Republic, entitled to all the privileges of such.
I often encounter great hesitancy about and impatience with discussing race when talking about the American past. The obvious difficulty with those kinds of complaints is that the people in the past talked a lot about and did a lot about race. It isn't some newly discovered fad topic. Race is right there in the documents, official and personal. It would take a concerned effort not to consider and analyze the subject. And I realize that evasion is exactly what happened in many of the textbooks that Americans used in their school social studies and history classes. This, in part, accounts for the pained accusations about revisionist history, when historians talk about things that people had never been made aware of in their history.
People want the individuals from the past they admire to be right on the question of race, no matter how wrong they actually were, so that admiring such people poses no problem. What does this mean for Black Texans thinking of the Texas of the past? Being a historian, trying to think and write effectively about the American founding, a period in which Black people were living under oppression at the hands of people who did some other things that I admire, requires a degree of detachment. I don't feel hostage to others' conceptions of what Texas should mean to me, or accept that Texas belongs exclusively to any group of people who lived or live there. Being a Black person and a Texan then are not in opposition.
A moment for reflection. How do you think about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget in our country?
Chapter 6, on Juneteenth. On June 19, 1865, Gordon Granger, a general in the Army of the United States of America, arrived in Galveston from his post in Louisiana to take command of all the troops in the American Army in Texas. The Civil War had been over since April, when the Army of the Northern Virginia, headed by General Robert E. Lee, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. Confederate soldiers in Texas, nevertheless, continued to fight on into May. Indeed, they were victorious in the last battle that took place on Texas soil on May 13th, the Battle of Palmetto Ranch near Brownsville, Texas. When it became clear that all other Confederate armies had essentially collapsed, their soldiers were deserting in large numbers. On June 2nd, 1865, General Kirby Smith, who commanded the Confederate Army of the Trans-Mississippi, surrendered in Galveston to the Army of the United States of America.
Texas had become a land in turmoil. Angry Confederate soldiers lashed out after their defeat. Some engaged in rioting and looting. Granger's job was to get to the state, impose some degree of order, and announce that all enslaved people were free. He, along with his staff, took up residence in a villa in Galveston. How Granger made the general order known throughout Galveston is disputed. Many histories have Granger reading the order from the balcony of his quarters. Other accounts say that Granger and soldiers went to strategic places throughout the city and read the order. In whatever way the news was disseminated, General Order Number 3 had a powerful effect in Texas.
The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involved an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present home and work for wages. This order was based on the Emancipation Proclamation that President Abraham Lincoln, who had been assassinated the previous April, had issued on New Year's Day, 1863. The 13th Amendment, still in the process of being ratified, provided no basis for it.
Some African Americans in Galveston, and likely other residents, already knew the gist of the general order. prior to June 19th. Galveston, the largest city in Texas, was a port through which most of the cotton picked and processed in the state was shipped out to the world. Port cities are perfect vehicles for transmission of information to people of all degrees of literacy. 2 days before General Granger arrived on the island, Black men working on the wharves began to shout in exultation. When asked what they were celebrating, they replied, because they were free. The news spread to other towns, but the former slaves had to be very wary of open celebration. While the holiday Juneteenth has grown to be an integral part of life in Texas, celebrated now by Blacks and whites, and it appears on its way to becoming a national holiday. Whites in Texas were incensed by what had transpired, so much so that some reacted violently to Blacks' display of joy at emancipation. In one town, dozens of newly freed slaves were whipped for celebrating.
All over the South, but in Texas particularly, whites unleashed a torrent of violence against the freedmen and women, and sometimes the whites who supported them, that lasted for years. The language of General Order Number 3 not only announced the end of slavery, after stating all slaves are free, quote unquote, the order continues, quote, this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. Language about equality echoed through the words of the American Declaration of Independence, quote, all men are created equal, unquote. People have long quibbled about what those words meant to Jefferson personally, as if that actually matters to whether the words are true or not. It does not. But Confederates had explicitly rejected the concept of equality announced in the Declaration, as the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, made clear in March 1861 in his famous Cornerstone speech.
The prevailing ideas entertained by Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that, somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution should be evanescent and pass away. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to white men, that slavery, subordination of the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great philosophical and moral truth.
That is the basis upon which Texas and other members of the Confederacy had formulated their society. The General Order announced a state of affairs that completely contravened the racial and economic ideals of the Confederacy. announcing the end of slavery would have been shocking enough. Stating that the former enslaved would now live in Texas on an equal plane of humanity with whites was on a different order of magnitude of shocking. The fear of the Black imagination was strong all throughout slavery. That was one of the reasons free African Americans posed such a problem, and was one of the reasons the Texas Constitution prevented the immigration of free Black people into the Republic. Seeing that Black people could exist outside of legal slavery put the lie to the idea that Blacks were born to be slaves.
Race relations entered a new phase a month after Granger departed Galveston in August. 2 months after General Order Number 3 was created, the federal agency set up to help the newly freed people in the wake of the change of their status. The Freedmen's Bureau opened its Texas branch in Galveston. Conceived as part of the United States Army, General Oliver Howard was made commissioner of the Bureau. Howard, the main career soldier who would go on to found and serve as the first president of Howard University, appointed Brigadier General Edgar M. Gregory, a New Yorker, as an assistant commissioner to head the Texas branch. Gregory walked into an almost impossible situation. Texas was so large, and violence against the freedmen and hostility toward the American army so great that it would have taken a far larger number than the men allotted to the Bureau to effectively carry out its mission. By most accounts, Gregory did the best he could for the newly freed African Americans, but he incurred the wrath of whites for doing so. General Howard, heading a new bureau that was underfunded and poorly staffed, found Texas the most difficult of all the regions under the Bureau's jurisdiction. Its white citizens the most resistant to efforts to effect changes in the position of Blacks in the state.
Why would white Texans be more obstreperous than other white Southerners? It's been suggested that this was because, unlike other Southern states, Texas had not been defeated militarily. They had won the last battle of the Civil War. That the state had been its own republic within the living memory of many Texans also set them apart from the other Confederates. The very thing that has been seen as a source of strength and pride for latter-day Texans may have fueled a stubbornness that prevented the state from moving ahead at this fruitful moment. Despite General Order Number 3, some enslavers continued to hold Blacks in slavery, making them work for no pay on the threats of violence. These were the kinds of situations the Bureau was designed in part to fix. Gregory noted with seeming surprise that Black Texans, in the face of this hostility, went about the business of making new lives in the state when they could have, in some places, unleashed carnage on their former enslavers. They, like freed people throughout the South, focused on other things, solemnizing their marriages, keeping away from the violence of whites, trying to reunite with family members who had been sold during slavery, working, and very happily taking advantage of the schools the Bureau created. Adults sat in classrooms with children, all eager to learn to read and write.
Black Texans were determined, despite the early intimidating anger of whites, to celebrate what was initially called Emancipation Day. Most of the first celebrations were in churches, in keeping with the culture of a generally religious people. I also wondered if holding meetings in churches were thought to provide some level of protection in those days. Later, in larger towns, the celebrations migrated to public spaces, though some sort of religious observance might be included in the program. In 1872, in Houston, four Black men, Richard Allen, Richard Brock, Elias Debble, and Jack Yates, pooled their resources and raised money to buy land in the city for the express purpose of celebrating the holiday, creating Emancipation Park, one of the oldest parks in Texas. Enthusiasm for the celebration held there, which consists of speeches, singing, music, waxed and waned over the years, but in the 21st century, the renewed interest in Juneteenth spurred the park's revival.
My family went to Houston's Emancipation Park only once, as I recall. All other Juneteenth celebrations were either at my home or at my grandparents' home. The day appeared to me as the first part of a 1-2 summer punch. June 19th followed closely by July 4th, the holiday expressly for Black Texans, and the other holiday for all Americans. As far as I knew, whites did not celebrate Juneteenth during my childhood, but everyone in my area celebrated the 4th. I do know of the tradition of Blacks celebrating July 5th as a protest to remind people that the ideas of July 4th had not been realized. When children celebrated with fireworks, my grandfather bought, settling off firecrackers and sparkles well into the night. The traditional Juneteenth menu, in addition to the usual Southern style cuisine, included red soda water, as we called it, and barbecued goat. Besides playing in my grandparents' front and backyards, lighting and throwing firecrackers, we spent the day pulling cans of bottle of soda out of the large tin buckets filled with ice.
We'll have a brief moment of silent reflection. What does Juneteenth mean to you?
Coda. This brief sketch of the history of Texas, told through vignettes of my family, calls to mind something I've often written and said about Jefferson's musings in Notes on the State of Virginia on African Americans' prospects in the United States, and what he wrote in his will about the 5 men he freed. Jefferson wrote in notes that an enslaved person, which because of the racially based nature of slavery in the country meant a Black person, could not love the country in which he or she lived. How could they love a country that did not love them, as evidenced by the way the country had treated them? Therefore, Blacks would be happier in some other place, their own country, free from the racial strife that he couldn't see as anything other than inevitable.
In his will, freeing the 5 men, however, Jefferson petitioned the legislature of Virginia to allow them to remain in the state. He had to do this because According to the Virginia law, an enslaved person who did not get permission to remain in Virginia within a year after emancipation could be sold back into slavery. When explaining why these men should be allowed to stay, Jefferson said, because Virginia was where their families and connections were.
When asked, as I have been very often, to explain what I love about Texas, given all that I know of what has happened there and is still happening there, the best response I can give is that this is where my first family and connections were. Texas is where my mother's boundless dreams for me took flight. It is also where I learned to think that people could and should try in whatever way they can to make life better for others alive today and for those to come.
Love does not require taking an uncritical stance toward the object of one's affections. In truth, it often requires the opposite. We can't be of real service to the hopes we have for places and people, ourselves included, without a clear-eyed assessment of their and our strengths and weaknesses. That often demands a willingness to be critical, sometimes deeply so. How that is done matters, of course. Striking the right balance can be exceedingly hard. I hope I've achieved the proper equilibrium.
This draws us to the conclusion of the public reading. I want to actually offer this last silent reflection as a prompt for our open conversation. What from tonight's public reading on Juneteenth touched you? Give a word of thanks to all of our readers this evening, to Rabbi Scott Perlow from Adat Shalom, to Antone for helping with our tech through the evening, and to all of you for joining with us from different parts across the country, as today, more than ever, we reaffirm history matters, telling this history matters, and we only become a stronger country by honestly engaging the truths of this land that we love, but that we know is not yet the perfect union it's meant to be. Reverend Janet, would you please close us with a word of prayer?
Thank you. Let us center ourselves. Let us calm our minds and hearts. Almighty Creator, who is called by many names, we thank you as we come before you for what our ears have heard, our eyes have seen, and our hearts have felt. We come today in remembrance, in gratitude, and resolve. We thank you for the freedom that was long delayed but never denied, for the resilience and the resolute of those who endured, and for the sacrifices that paved the way for justice. Creator, as we reflect on the readings and the voices shared today, may their voices stir something deep within us and wide across us, a commitment to truth, equity, and the ongoing work of liberation. Let us not be echoes, but let us be voices. Let Juneteenth be more than a history lesson, but a call to action, a reminder that the fight for justice is not finished and never will be finished, and that each of us is charged to stand for righteousness, love, and community. Holy Spirit, empower us to build bridges where there are divides, to speak boldly in the face of injustice, to speak truth to power, and to love unconditionally. May we be catalysts for healing advocates for equality, and champions for unity in your name. Bless this faith organization and all organizations and people here. Bless every hand and every heart that garnered, and bless the mission that continues beyond this day. Let us walk forward in faith, hope, and a deep sense of purpose. This is our prayer. This is our plea. In the mighty and matchless name of the Creator, we pray and believe. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Reverend Janet.